Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this particular video, I'm going to be looking at this all-important period from about the 8th to the 19th of June. Obviously, it has the full moon in there, hence the full moon in the title, but really it's about a lot more than that. And we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of, I hate to say more serious astrology, but you know what I mean, more technical, more globally oriented, let's put it that way. But before I begin, let me thank you again for subscribing, and please subscribe more, helps our channel to grow. And also thank you for your comments, which are so interesting, such a lot of them. And I do try to get round to them all and reply, but some, as you know, you just get a little heart. And I do my best to address the ones that are probably a little bit more technical, I guess. And of course, we are living in exceptional times. And when we look at this cluster of influences that are coming up and are going to be discussed on this video, I think you'll know exactly what I mean. Well, this full moon, let's talk about that in the first place. And so we're looking at that on the 11th of June, full moon in Sagittarius. It's called a strawberry moon. Which is rather lovely, and obviously because in the Northern Hemisphere, where we get this title from, this was a season when the strawberries were lush and fruity. So it's a nice concept, isn't it? The idea of a fruity strawberry full moon. Not, I think, that it has anything to do with the full moon itself, but certainly, especially if you're a Sagittarian or you're a Gemini, these two signs, it's very important for, really. And I'll go into that in more detail on another video to follow this, which is where I look at it from the perspective of all 12 signs. But full moons are always times of completion. We could try to make it conscious so that we think, what do I need to sort of tie up and put away, even if that's put away temporarily, as we often do when we go through the seasons. We don't wear the same thing, we don't do the same thing. And so being able to put away last season and focus on the new one is one way, really, of just saying, you know, marking the end of chapters and a new seasonal chapter. But of course, we can do all sorts of other things. We can decide what in our lives really serves no purpose. And often that has to do with repetitive tasks that we do because we always do them. And if we didn't do them, my goodness, we'd have created some more time to do things that are more important. But it's also a time, and especially if it connects with something in our natal chart, that we may want to seriously think about, do I need this person in my life anymore? Do I need this relationship? Do I need this job? Do I need this situation? And sort of deciding, putting it away, ending it on a full moon is always a bit more power driven. You're giving more kind of astrological power to the decision or the action that you want to take. Let's also think about where we are in terms of what I'm calling this important period, which is about the 8th through to the 19th. And it's probably easier if we look at it according to the chart, and then I can point out things to you as we go. So let's have a look at this full moon in Sagittarius, and we can then take a look at all the other aspects. And in fact, I put them on the side here, which hopefully you can see. First thing we want to look at is that full moon, and that cuts across the 8 o'clock, 2 o'clock position in the circle, 20 degrees Gemini 39, 20 degrees Sagittarius. Well, it says 40, but that's sometimes it's getting a split second to get it to the right one, but believe you me, that's a full moon there. And on this occasion, there isn't really anything connecting to that full moon. Often we have had in the past Saturn or Uranus. We've had these two planets playing into our full moons, and it has tended to make that period a really a very controversial one, because Saturn and Uranus are two planets you don't want to mess about with. They bring a lot of change. They bring a lot of heavy situations that we need to go through, examine, learn from, all that kind of stuff. And some of the main events of the year have clustered around the full moons, especially when they've had Saturn involved in them. And, you know, I think back to Pope Francis, who took ill really on that full, on the lunar eclipse, in fact, and there were serious concerns that, you know, he would die. Well, in fact, he got through that period, but not very, very long after that, on the Easter time, he left us. And so, you know, we have a lot of things coming to a head on a full moon. And sometimes those things we know about because we can sense them. We can sense things reaching a crisis point, or we know full well when we look at our diary or our agenda or our Google page, whatever it is, where we find out what we're doing. We can see that we've got some important events clustered around a full moon, particularly. But the action of a full moon, when you think about the action of the moon on the tides, when we think of the emotional tides for all of us, well, things come to a peak. And occasionally, those are things we are unconscious of. We don't know what is simmering and what comes up to the surface. So it's always worth looking at those full moons and both preparing for them, in the sense that let's tie things up, let's bring an end to this, let's close this down. So we're doing it consciously, but also being prepared when we get into situations to see if that isn't a climate in which tempers will be easily lost and things said that we don't mean to say, or whether something does bubble up now, present itself, and we really have to deal with it. These are all things that should be in our minds at a full moon time. When we think about the idea again of a full moon, the moon is opposed to the sun. They're at opposite points of the zodiac, with the earth in between them. So at one level, we're looking at a polarity, we're looking at opposites, but at the same time, there is a sense of union, which is why we think of full moons as times when we might sign on the dotted line. We might close and complete a deal, but at the same time, it can be a time when we decide we are too far apart from someone to continue in the same vein, whether that means the end of a relationship or whether it means a separation and a breathing space. That's why we have the joint or the dual meaning of a full moon, which is both unity and separation. So if we look down the list here at the same time as we're looking at the image here, you can see I've drawn some red lines between things. And that's because the full moon, sun opposition moon, we can see there at the 8 o'clock, 2 o'clock position. But we've also got a Venus aligned with Pluto at the very top of the chart, the midnight position, Venus at just above the 9 o'clock position. And that is because Venus will be squaring Pluto on the 9th. And I'll come back, I'll talk about that in a minute. Another red line that we want to look at here is Mars down at the 6 o'clock position, squaring Uranus in the sort of 8 to 9 position. Now, Mars is going to square Uranus on the 15th of June. And we must remember that 7 or 8 days before each of these exact aspects, the connections are going to be getting stronger and stronger. So at any point in that time, do we have the effect of what these two or three or whatever we're looking at, how they may manifest. Now, yes, I'll mention this briefly. We can see also, if we look at Mercury and Jupiter and the Sun, and they're sort of gathered together there in the 8 o'clock position, you'll see there's a black line from Jupiter to Neptune, Jupiter to Saturn, and a red line from Mercury to Neptune and Mercury to Saturn. And that's because both Jupiter and Mercury will be squaring Saturn and Neptune during this period of time that I'm going to be talking about. So these are the key things. These are hands on the cosmic clock pointing to very important developments. And again, we need to be a little bit relaxed about this. So we think about, a couple of days before, 3 days afterwards, they're still going to have meaning. So if we come to my little list on the left here, and I've got the 5th of June, Venus sextiling Jupiter, very gentle, happy combination between these two things. The 6th, Venus comes into Taurus, very good news for all Taurians and also Scorpios, because for Scorpios, Venus will be coming into your 7th solar house, and that's all about relationships. When we think about Venus, just as a principle, it's not just about love, it's about harmony, it's about balance, it's about getting things into a shape where we can appreciate them. And this is where we get the idea of peace from, Venus being the principle of peace, but also the principle of justice. And we're also looking at money and finance and the economy. And the fact that Venus rules the sign of Taurus means that during the coming month, which takes us through to early July, then things to do with the economy are going to be super important. And of course, things to do with our own finances. And that's just a general kind of principle. One of the nice things I think about Venus and Taurus, and if you have Venus in Taurus natally, then there's often a real love of the earth and the things, the fruits of the earth, the abundance of life. It's very much an earth goddess image, Venus in Taurus. And during the time that Venus is in Taurus, I think we might find there's more awareness of the earth itself and the fruits of the earth. And of course, at this time, we're always hearing about climate change and the things that are happening to our beautiful earth, but it will become sort of super emphasized during this period from June through to early July. The 8th of June, we've got Mercury conjunct Jupiter. I remember doing this, I made an audio about this, and it's always my good news combination. Mercury Jupiter is good news. And hopefully that means good news somewhere in life for all of us. And maybe in general, the news is good. But of course, we've only got to look at where Mercury and Jupiter are to see that, hey, they're not terribly far away from Neptune and Saturn to realize that actually news at this time can be rather complicated, maybe some very mysterious developments, maybe even more of the spin we're getting on situations, and maybe some more of the situations that we simply don't understand why they are the way they are. Of course, this is just a general comment here. On the 9th of June, Jupiter enters Cancer. Now, I am going to be doing a whole separate video on Jupiter's entry into Cancer, and I'm going to be looking at it from the perspective of the 12 signs. So I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on that. Where I want to take us to, and what I'm going to focus some time on in this particular video, is going to be the Jupiter-Neptune square and the Jupiter-Saturn square. So I'm going to be spending some time on that in a minute. But first, let's have a look at that Mars-Uranus square, which happens to be on the same day as the Jupiter-Saturn square and just a couple of days after the full moon. What do we know about Mars and Uranus? Well, let's put these two principles together. And we think about Mars, the planet of action, the planet of conflict, the planet of passion. And we think about Uranus, shock and awe, a kind of explosive quality to Uranus, always something coming out of the blue, kind of revolutionary. Uranus is also the planet of the digital world, of all things to do with technology. So often on a big aspect to Uranus, we'll get some breakthrough in technology or with space or those kind of things. That's all very Mars-Uranus. But of course, conflict is very Mars-Uranus as well. And we've got plenty of conflict going on already all over the world, but particularly in Ukraine and particularly in Gaza. So these are situations that will be very sensitive to this Mars-Uranus square, likely to get more intense at this time. And of course, tempers are frayed on a Mars-Uranus aspect. People do things in the heat of the moment, and often that can turn out to be irrevocable and very destructive. So, when you look at this little timetable I have here, as we get nearer the 15th, remember, if situations start to annoy you, people start to annoy you, there are things you're getting very frustrated about, do your best to keep a lid on it and not to get to a situation where you just think, oh, I'm done with this. And you have no control over what the result of that action, feeling may be. But I'm quite interested in this because if we look at this full moon, and because I'm looking at the charts of leaders all the time, and I'm looking at countries, particularly America, but also my own country, the United Kingdom, and now Russia is another country I'm always looking at, and Ukraine. These are major places of interest, plus the charts of Israel are in my mind, which is why when I see something like this full moon at this degree, I immediately think, oh, that's significant, because guess what? That full moon cuts across this leader's chart or that country's MCIC axis. So in fact, what immediately struck me was that this particular full moon is on Donald Trump's Sun-Moon opposition. So let's have a look at his chart here. Now, although his birthday is the 14th of June, and this particular full moon is on the 11th of June, so there's a 3-day difference, as you'll see, we're not too far away from what the moon is at 21 degrees of Sagittarius in Donald Trump's chart. And of course, this full moon is at 20 degrees, 39, 40 minutes. So we're very close to the moon, a little bit further from the sun. And just to remind ourselves about Mr. Trump again, President Trump, he was born not just on a full moon. And remember, I've been talking about the idea of polarities here, about bringing both union and separation. And people born on the full moon have the capacity to divide and separate every bit as much as they have to unite. So it's an interesting thing when you think about Donald Trump's rather mercurial Gemini personality, his desire to be a great peacemaker, his real dislike, hatred of war, and yet at the same time, what does he do but divide people? Look at what the tariffs have done. So we see this very clearly etched in his personality. But in fact, this full moon, 20 degrees, 39 minutes of Gemini Sagittarius, is on Donald Trump's nodal axis. And as I said, he was born on a lunar eclipse. So it is quite significant that he should have this full moon on his nodal axis. And we know the nodal axis is all about fateful developments. If you have somebody's sun on your north node or your south node, that person is going to play a part in your life. It may not seem to be an important part, but it almost certainly will. And we also think about events when, for instance, this full moon cuts across a nodal axis like this. We know this period is going to be extremely fateful for Donald Trump. And when we also think about, well, there's other things going on in this chart, we get the kind of theme of the full moon, which is closure and completion, but also the idea of separation. Not only will this be a period when he's at his very best, whether it comes to uniting people or separating them, dividing them, But also, this is a time of stress, I think, for President Trump. And we're not very far away from that point. And as you know, really, right since President Trump took power, it's been a rolling kind of, well, almost a daily kind of eventful set of experiences, whether we're thinking about all the departments that have suddenly disappeared in government, whether they're constitutional challenges, whether we're looking at his role with leaders. We think about Zelensky, we think about Cyril Ramaphosa, who also came under President Trump's interesting way of dealing with leaders from other countries, let's put it that way. And we see that there has been an awful lot of change and hiatus already with this administration. So this, to me, looks like something of a peak for Donald Trump. And, you know, we've talked about this idea of peaks before and in connection with President Trump, because it's this idea that when you're at the peak of anything, you're also at the point where you're going down again. So we can see this in a small way with a rise and fall in popularity, perhaps, but we can see it in a much bigger way in the sense of one's life's progress. Now, what makes this full moon even more interesting and potentially important is the fact that at the same time we have that applying Mars-Uranus square. Now, if you remember, if we look back at the chart of the full moon, we've got Mars at 26 of Leo, we've got Uranus at 28 of Taurus. Now, if we look at Donald Trump's chart here, his natal Mars is 26 degrees of Leo. So he's got a Mars return, and not only a Mars return, but a Mars square Uranus return. So he will be at his most provocative. So he will be making big waves around this particular period of time. And again, I mean, you know, there have been lots of incidents with President Trump where you felt he skated very near. He's a, you know, he takes a lot of risks, and this is probably not a period which, you know, one should be taking risks on a Mars-Uranus square. And I would certainly advise, if I was in that capacity to President Trump, that I would advise him to be quite low key around this full moon time. Take a bit of a break, take a couple of days off, chill, meditate, yoga, all the sorts of things I don't think he does. But it would be advisable to do such things. Because otherwise, I think he is at risk of an accident, or he is at risk of perhaps being vulnerable to attack, whether we think about, you know, he's only narrowly did they manage to get the big, beautiful bill through. I mean, 215 to 214 votes. I mean, that's pretty narrow. So he is, you know, he's got battles on his hands within his own party, as well as within Congress and within America. So there's that side of things, you know, of being under attack. But also, this could be another one of those times when you definitely want to have a very active and alert Secret Service, because this is, you know, very potentially explosive. So we probably need to look out for that. So let's get on to these main events that I really want to talk about. And I'm going to start really with the idea that Saturn and Neptune are really very close at this time. They're within a degree of each other. And by the time we get to early July, they're going to be within 13 minutes of each other. So they're so close as to already be giving us a feel of this Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Now, I am going to do a separate video on that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, so I'm not going to get into the ramifications of that. But what I am going to look at is Jupiter squaring Saturn and Jupiter squaring Neptune, because this is rather an important part of the story. And I'm going to begin really with the Jupiter-Saturn square. Rewind just for a second. When you put two planets together, they combine their different properties. And you can see this in a positive sense, and you can see it in a negative sense. For instance, if you combine Saturn and Neptune, you get dreams into reality, but you also get broken dreams. You get the idea of Neptune eroding Saturnian structures, and at the same time, you get the idea of Saturn bringing structure and form to Neptunian kind of dreams, the ethereal quality of Neptune, which is very indistinct. You get things taking shape. So that's how you work with them. But as you get planets like, for instance, Jupiter squaring Saturn, Jupiter squaring Neptune, they have their own separate meaning. And that's what I want to look at this particular time. So Jupiter-Saturn combinations. Again, we've got a bit of an opposite function here because so much as Saturn crystallizes, Saturn is also constricting, it's blocking, it's creating boundaries, it's saying, only this far, you don't go further than this, let's keep this in check, let's put a prison wall up, or is that a fortress? Remember, I've talked about that before. Is that boundary a fortress or is it a prison? There are two very different ways to look at it. And we look at Jupiter and we think about Jupiter, which is excess. It's about exuberance and joy and, expansion, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you see why these two together are kind of a very complicated duo. They have a pretty good reputation in terms of finance. And Jupiter-Saturn combos can be very, very good for the economy. But when we just look at Jupiter and Saturn as a principle, and then we think about the structures in society, we think about constitutions, we think about things that give form and structure and growth in a big way to nations and organizations. So they're a pretty important combo. So we look at the cycle because planets have cycles, which they start when they come together, they're in conjunction, and then they each take a different amount of time to come round again to their next conjunction, which will be in a different place in a different sign, of course. So the last Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was in 2020, and it was in the December of 2020. And it had just gone into Aquarius at that time, very, very end of Capricorn, almost teetering on the 0 degrees of Aquarius. So in that era, which is particularly important, and the Jupiter-Saturn cycle always plays an important part in America because the new presidents or elections are held according to that Jupiter-Saturn cycle. We always have a big election on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and we can trace that through the cycle thereafter. So, of course, when we look at 2020, who came into the administration, into the White House, but Joe Biden. So Joe Biden came in with Jupiter and Saturn at the very, very end of Capricorn. By the time he was inaugurated, they were just at the very early 1st degree of Aquarius. And if you may remember, that election was very, very controversial with a great many people, including President Trump, believing it was stolen. And of course, the January 6th insurrection happened just before the inauguration. So we need to sort of look back to that point, that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the December of 2020, because that started the cycle. And remember, it's just kind of 0 degrees of Aquarius. So we look at where we are now with Jupiter square Saturn. We have Saturn now in Aries, and we have Jupiter in Cancer. And they are in the very 1st degree of Aries and Cancer. And 0 to 1 degree of the cardinal signs, that's Aries, Libra, Cancer, and Capricorn, are what we might call power points. These are really hot points. So things tend to happen at that point. They tend to be more spectacular. They tend to be more important. So that you've got this Jupiter-Saturn square coming at a time or at a point where things are extremely powerful. So the events that happen at this time are going to be very important. And although, we just looked at President Trump's chart and we're talking about the American election, or we think about the Jupiter-Saturn square at 1 degree of Aries Cancer, and we know that this has a lot to do with constitutions, it has a lot to do with the economy. So we absolutely know that around this period of time, there are going to be some incredibly important developments. And, changing the constitution, of course, that is a matter in different ways for different countries. But it may be generally in different countries an important point for constitutional change. If we come again specifically to America, and we think that normally most changes and laws that they have to be, put in motion by Congress and the Justice, the Supreme Court. There have been some incidents up to this point where the administration has decided to not go that way and to do things quickly and more effectively themselves. So there has been a lot of murmurings about, is this constitutional and what's happening to the Constitution of America? So I think around this time of the Jupiter-Saturn square, we are definitely going to have issues related to the Constitution in America, but also other countries as well. So if we come to the Jupiter-Neptune square, and remember, we're looking at these, there's like 3 days different. They're so distant, they're so close, they're happening simultaneously, but we can separate the two. And it's important to do the separation so that we understand how each one is working. And Jupiter-Neptune combinations are so very different from Jupiter-Saturn combinations. Jupiter-Neptune combos, they have a lot to do with mass movements. They have a lot to do with extremes of ideology. They have a lot to do with grand deceptions and also grand visions. And we also feel that there are a lot of extreme weather trends that seem to go with Jupiter-Neptune combos. And we have, especially with water and shipping. And we've had a lot of that stuff already really going on. And I think I talked once or twice, and we had the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction was in April of 2022. And if we go back to that period, just prior to that Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, we had that sea quake underneath the sea, just outside Tonga, the island of Tonga, and that completely rendered all the cables lying on the seabed there, cutting off communication for Tonga. So it was a massive event. And we've only got to think about that happening perhaps in a more populated area of the world, and that might be it was serious enough for Tonga, but it would be extremely serious, in perhaps a country a little bit more populated. So that's a very typical example of a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. Also during that year, even though Jupiter and Neptune weren't exactly conjunct, they'd moved a little farther apart, we also celebrated Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee. And that was at the time when they were in conjunction. And that was such a grand celebration for Great Britain. But only 3 months later, we lost Queen Elizabeth II. So we could see that Jupiter-Neptune conjunctions have a lot to do with, mass events or important events on a kind of global scale. And they can be great and good. They can be divine, but they can also be the absolute opposite. And what was interesting really for me, and I'll come on to that, well, maybe I'll mention it now, is that Queen Elizabeth II was born on a Jupiter-Neptune opposition, and she left us on a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. And there are a lot of other people who exemplify this Jupiter-Neptune vibe, so to speak. Boris Johnson has a Jupiter-Neptune opposition. And often Jupiter-Neptune people have great success in life. They make a lot of money. They have a lot of influence over people. Guess who else has Jupiter and Neptune in their chart? Elon Musk. But also Julian Assange has a Jupiter Neptune conjunction. And, you know, whether you think he did the right thing by whistleblowing or not, whether you think he's a saint or a sinner, and you can have both with a Jupiter Neptune conjunction, it's fascinating that he does indeed have a Jupiter Neptune conjunction. Guess who else has a Jupiter Neptune conjunction? Zelensky. No, it's an opposition. Zelensky. And again, you know, whether you think he is a great president and a good man, or whether you believe he's really not helping Ukraine or the Russia-Ukraine situation, you're entirely entitled to your view. But I think it's very interesting that he has this Jupiter-Neptune vibe in his chart, which is about, you know, the belief in the country, the belief in leading the country in this very, very strong way. He has great vision for Ukraine. He wants to maintain the vision of sovereignty for Ukraine. So that's very interesting. I'll tell you someone else who has a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. That's Prince Harry. Now, of course, Prince Harry at the moment, see how old he is. He's 40, he's coming up to 41. He's got a long life ahead of him, we hope, and hopefully during the course of this life, he will do a lot of great things, because in a way, the desire to help heal and save is very strong with a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in your chart. And we've heard a lot from Harry about mental health and how he wants to help people. But at the same time, it's very interesting how Jupiter-Neptune people can often feel entitled to something, that they are entitled to this role or that kind of behavior or that action. And we see this very clearly with Prince Harry at the moment, who seems to have gone off on a bit of a crusade. Very good Jupiter-Neptune concept. And his battle has been protection for himself and his family. And he's been fighting the establishment, for want of a better word, in order to get that protection, which he feels is his divine right, so to speak. And we don't need to go into all of that, but it's interesting that he has a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. Last but not least, Princess Diana also had a Jupiter-Neptune square. She also had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So she had all of these things together in her chart. And when you think about Diana, how charismatic she was, that Neptune in the first house of hers, Jupiter at the very base of her chart. And we think about the sacrifice she made, however you want to interpret that. Certainly, dying young, she died a martyr in a way, a martyr to her popularity. I mean, however you want to see that. I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories or any of that. She died young. It was a tragedy. And that Jupiter-Neptune quality, which was to give her this great charisma and this great desire to help heal and save the world, which of course we can see Harry, you know, all of those things. In the end, it became her undoing. So we can get quite a lot of information about a Jupiter-Neptune combo from looking at the people who exemplify what Jupiter and Neptune can do. And also thinking about the times that we live in. We're thinking about when they were in conjunction, they began their cycle, what was going on at that particular time. And now here we're at the first square. So we are looking at sometimes the events that happened at that time of the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction Where are we now looking back at that time? Can we sort of review situations? Do we reassess, or have some of those things come back to be re-examined in a different way? And I think it'll be interesting to watch, particularly with, when we think about Elon Musk, who's exemplifying this Jupiter-Neptune vibe, which he has in his natal chart. It's opposed to Saturn, incidentally, which is interesting. It's like Diana, we've got Saturn in the mix as well, which does make them durable, I have to say. Saturn is about long term, isn't it? It's about longevity. It is about bringing things into reality. And so, you know, Musk isn't just someone who has great ideas and they go nowhere. He's able to manufacture them. He's able to bring them into reality. And it's very interesting because at the time that I'm talking to you, which is the end of May, we know that Musk has taken a sort of step back from Doge. He's not so involved with the government and and all the things that he was very much in charge of at the beginning of the Trump administration. He's taken a back seat. He's going back to spend more time in what what he's known for, really, these great feats of engineering, which we'll see more of. But it's going to be interesting. I think in my overview for 2025, which I know a lot of you have bought, you know, I did think that we'd see the end of Elon Musk in terms of his role in government, and that really is as it is. I mean, what you're seeing on the surface at the moment is, no, he's still very much involved. He's still very much part of the presidential team, blah, blah, blah. But I think the evidence would say different, because he's certainly not taking that much of a part. You know, we're no longer seeing him wielding an electric saw or whatever it was. He's definitely taken a back seat from that. So we'll see how he goes this year. But what goes up must come down. And it strikes me that there's a certain amount of hubris attached with Jupiter-Neptune combos. You've got to keep on that fine line between using your good fortune and the talents you were brought, you came into this world with, to use them in a way that is, we might call, for want of a better word, a good way, not a bad way, not getting into fraud and all those kind of things, but keeping on the straight and narrow. But when you do err off that track, your natural good fortune will leave you, or we could see it really as hubris, don't we? And I think anyone with a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, square, or opposition has to be wary of that. Am I getting too big for my boots? Do I believe my whatever I'm doing is endless, will go on, there is no stopping it? Is there no stopping me? This is why sometimes the Jupiter-Neptune combos have a bit of a reputation for being in the charts of narcissist as well. So we have to be careful we're not getting above ourselves. We're not flying too close to the sun and getting our wings singed. So these are things that come to mind when we look at this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. So again, yes, these are the things that I wanted to talk about specifically on this video. It gives us such a much greater perspective, doesn't it, on what's going on at the moment. I mean, astrology is a language, really. I mean, we even use words like Saturnine, you know, jovial is Jupiterian. And the language of astrology is a beautiful way of looking at events through the prism of the astrology, which I try to do, particularly on these videos that cover the more mundane aspect of what's going on at this time. So that's it for this little block of 9 or so days. As I said, there'll be a separate video on Jupiter and Cancer. There will be a separate video on the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And what will follow this one is this full moon and its other component parts, sign by sign. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.